Jack Dempsey versus Smoking Joe Frazier, going out to DJ 1974. Let's get into it. By the way, thank you for this request. This is a tremendous fight from two hard-hitting heavyweights who both fought in killer eras. They both fought in great eras. I probably say this in every video, these are the days where you actually had to fight to prove that you were the best. There was no ducking, avoidance, running around each other. I mean, the best had to go head to head with the best. It's just the way that it was, and it was a beautiful thing for the fans. So, Jack Dempsey versus Smoking Joe Frazier. Let's get into it. What makes this a beautiful fight is that they have similar styles. Both guys are hard-hitting heavyweights. Both guys have great head movement. They both dip real well. They both have great left hooks, and they're both pressure fighters. Jack Dempsey definitely has the size advantage, but I believe that Joe Frazier is more refined as a fighter. Jack Dempsey hit hard, but sometimes Jack Dempsey had the tendency to load up on his shots and leave himself wide open, whereas Joe Frazier's shots were shorter. His fights were shorter, and they got to the target a lot quicker. I see some similarities between Jack Dempsey and young George Foreman, which would give him the advantage in this fight, or a advantage in this fight. One of the similarities is the physicality, the grabbing, the pushing, the manhandling. And George Foreman did that to Joe Frazier in their first fight, and we remember the results of that fight. So that's definitely something to think about in favor of Jack Dempsey. This will be an explosive fight. I mean, I don't think either one of these guys would take a backward step, and this is definitely a fight that would take place in a phone booth. Back and forth action. Both of these guys have great punch resistance from what I see from both guys. So this will be a tremendous fight. This will be a tremendous fight. It may come down to who lands the first punch. I don't know. But going back to my point about Joe Frazier being more refined, his punches being shorter, Jack Dempsey's not afraid to let his hands go. That's one thing I've noticed. He will get in there and he will let those hands go. But I see some countering opportunities for Smoking Joe because of the way that Jack Dempsey draws his punches back. I mean, don't get me wrong. Once the punches reach the target, I mean, it was normally lights out for his opponents. And so Jack Dempsey was a very dangerous fighter. He fought in a brutal era that was basically barbaric. I mean, these guys were warriors back then. They were warriors in Frazier's day too. But I feel that there were more advancements in training, in styles and techniques by the time Frazier came along. So this is the reason that I'm leaning towards Frazier. Not that Jack Dempsey wasn't good, not that he wasn't tough, but just doing style comparisons. Just the fact that Joe Frazier throws his punches shorter. He's more calculating with his attack, although they're both great pressure fighters. But Joe Frazier's just more calculating. Seems like he's more patient. I do think that the fact that Jack Dempsey is not afraid to let his hands go might give Frazier trouble. So Frazier can't wait too long. I mean, he has to get to Jack Dempsey. He has to go to the body early, land his left hook first. Just simply get his shots off first. So, great fight, explosive fight. Anything can happen with heavyweights. It could go the distance. Someone could get knocked out. But with a fight like this, I would love to see it go the distance. I would love to see it go the whole 15 rounds. But I think that Smoking Joe Frazier gets him late, possibly in the last round. So I'm going to go with Smoking Joe Frazier by knockout. Let me know what you think. Prime this, prime that, everywhere a prime. All I hear these days is primes, primes, primes. This fighter didn't beat that fighter in their prime. That fighter didn't face this fighter in their prime. This fighter avoided that fighter in their prime. That fighter wouldn't have beaten this fighter in their prime. Prime, prime, prime. Let's get into primes, okay? From what I've observed over the years, it seems like fighters' primes are different. I'm not an expert on a fighter's primes, but, it's often said or often thought that fighters are better when they're younger. That's when they're in their prime. Or midway through their career. That's when they're in their prime. And in some cases, fighters are better past their primes. Some fighters get better with age. They get more wisdom in the ring, with George Foreman and Bernard Hopkins being prime examples. And I'll even throw Floyd in there. Okay? Primes, primes, primes. It just seems to be the pass that we give when we don't like the results of a fight. I'll give you a prime example. Prime example. And you probably know which fight I'm going to use as an example. Mayweather versus Pacquiao. Old Floyd avoided Pacquiao in his prime. Pacquiao would have murdered Floyd if Pacquiao was in his prime. Floyd avoided a prime Pacquiao. You know what's so funny about that? Pacquiao wasn't in his prime when him and Floyd fought, but guess what? Floyd wasn't in his prime either. We seem to think that Floyd has an eternal prime. Let me tell you something. As good as Floyd is, Floyd was no spring chicken when they fought. And Floyd is older than Pacquiao. Someone was trying to discredit Joe Calzaki's win over Roy Jones Jr. And you know what they said? He did not beat a prime Roy. A prime Roy would have murdered him. Do we know that for sure? Do we? Sure, Roy was older, but Roy was sharp in that fight. He even dropped Joe. And so is it always the fact that these fighters aren't in their prime, or could it perhaps be that they had the right style to beat the other fighter? Could it perhaps be that they may be better than that fighter? Another fight that gets the prime excuse. Lennox Lewis versus Mike Tyson. Lennox Lewis wouldn't have beaten a prime Mike Tyson, of course. No disrespect to Tyson, but could it perhaps be that Tyson has always had trouble with the jab? Could it be that the jab was Tyson's weakness and Lennox Lewis beat Tyson because he had the very thing in his arsenal that was Tyson's weakness, which was his jab? Prime, prime, prime. Canelo versus Triple G. We can argue over the results of two close fights all day. I personally think Canelo won. Some say Triple G won. There's a good argument for both sides. There's a good argument. I personally believe Canelo won both fights. That's just me. I'm sure you'll let me know what you think about my opinion, which is good. I want to hear from you. It's always the prime. We can't give everyone the prime pass. Sometimes the other man is just better, or the other fighter is just better. Sometimes the other fighter just simply has the game plan to get the job done. Sometimes it just may not be the other fighter's night. Now, I'm not saying that there are some fighters that weren't in their prime when they lost Evander Holyfield's last fight. The name of the guy he fought escapes me. But that's a legitimate argument for not beating a fighter in their prime. But if the fighter that we're trying to defend shows signs of his or her old self, if the fighter that we're trying to give the prime pass to has looked good in their last few fights, then we can't give them the prime pass simply because they lost. Because I'll tell you this, I guarantee you that if Pacquiao would have beaten Floyd, his prime would have never come up. And Floyd wouldn't have gotten the same excuse. If Pacquiao would have beaten Floyd, nobody would have said that Pacquiao didn't beat a prime Floyd. We would have given Pacquiao full credit for that win. You know it, and I know it. Pacquiao wasn't in his prime, but Floyd wasn't in his prime either, so they were on a level playing field. And so we just have to stop using excuses when we don't like the results. I'm sorry. I am sorry. Deontay Wilder, my favorite current heavyweight. Tyson Fury beat him fair and square, the second time and the third time. I thought the draw in the first fight was legitimate, but I didn't give any excuses for Wilder. As a matter of fact, I didn't agree with any excuses that was offered up. So sometimes it is what it is. I wanted Wilder to win. Tyson Fury was the better man. Both fights. It's that simple. So we can't excuse everything we don't like. Sometimes I don't like the results. Sometimes I made wrong predictions, and I hate when I do that. But it is what it is. Fight another day. But we are going to ridiculous extremes to discredit fighters. If you want to criticize a fighter, fine. But within reason. Within reason. Within the realm of reality. People just cannot give Floyd Mayweather credit for defeating Canelo Alvarez. You've heard the excuses. Canelo was green. Canelo wasn't ready. Floyd picked on a young boy. Floyd picked on a young, innocent boy. Floyd took advantage of him. Is that reasonable? Are any of those excuses reasonable? Come on. Come on, fans. I'm done.